Wanted to do a video of my cabin top before I got any farther along with it. I've glued all my deck beams down and I've planed them all. I'll show you that when I take this off. This is just a dry fit. I've done a rough cutout for the companionway, and in the plans it points out that the cabin top we give an extra ½ inch. So there's a ½ inch of overlap here on the bulkhead, and that's just in case your bulkhead ends up a little bit out of position. There's also overlap around the perimeter as well, which is why it overhangs. So what I've done is I have made a rough cutout here, starting with some notches for these little stand-up things. That's the front, or excuse me, the aft edge of the inner coaming for the sliding hatch. And I've lined up at the front on the bulkhead. I'll show you that. And then I've put a couple of drywall screws at the front corners to hold the panel there, and I've got a bucket here weighing the middle down. And then I went inside and traced a rough opening, which I cut out about 1/4 inch smaller than the finished opening. So here I've got these edges flush with the bulkhead, and I've got them lined up on my tabernacle vertical lines. And what I'm going to do next is make the final cutouts for the forward hatch and cut the companionway opening out a little better. And the reason I'm going to do that is it will allow me basically to keep working on this after I glue this down. And if you've been following, you know that I don't always do things the way we show in the plans, and I'm going to do this differently also. Let me get down in and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, we're inside. We've got the forward bulkhead. This portion of the cabin top between bulkhead 1 and 2 is solid, and then this portion here gets cut out for the forward hatch, but not the complete opening, just along the front and the sides, and then back. I believe it's 19 3/8 inches back, which is about 2 inches ahead of the forward hanging knee. The companionway here gets cut out flush with the aft hanging knee here and flush with the inner cockpit beams. So what I've done is I've taken a mark along here to show me where to cut, and the way I did that was with a razor blade. I held a razor blade here and I scraped it flat along the edge, and it made a sharp little line in the epoxy. These have been pre-coated with epoxy but not sanded yet. So what I'm going to do next is put a couple of drywall screws here in these corners, and between these two and the two in the top of the forward bulkhead, that locks these panels where I want them. And then I'm going to take these off, cut along these score lines, and cut this out. I've also scored this cut out. And then I'm going to sand the entire underside of the cabin top panels. And then I'm going to cut a pair of butt blocks to go underneath. I'm going to put a butt block from here to there, and a butt block from here to here, which is under the garage where the sliding hatch slides into along the top. So there'd be a butt block along that joint and that joint forward up there. Now in the plans it actually says to join the two panels port and starboard with a layer of 3-inch fiberglass tape top and bottom. And that's another way to do it, and that's fine. That method, you would just put it on the table, glass one side, flip it over, glass the other side. I'm trying to get this done faster, so the butt blocks actually will allow me to screw each edge into the butt block, which will keep the panel flat in the middle and allow me to glue the whole thing down right now. If I was going to glass it together, then I've got to wait till at least tomorrow to bend the panel down over the cabin top. And I still have a little bit of trimming on my beams, which again I'll show you in a second. and I did this dry fit so that I could pull down on the edges of the cabin top and check anywhere that I might need to relieve the top of the beams a little bit more. So that's what I'm going to do with my cabin top. And like I said, these were pre-coated with 3 coats on the bench, and they're going to get sanded here with 80 grit sandpaper before we glue them down. You'll also see we've still got dry wood in here. Some of this could have been pre-coated, but we just didn't. Some of these panels here are still pre-coated. Everything below the side stringer Taylor has got coated, but there's still some dry spots, obviously. You can see here and here where we haven't gotten the coating done yet. And we're just basically putting that off because it's not 100% high priority. We're trying to get the exterior done and the bottom done. So that's where we're at. I've got the first side back on the boat after I cut out the forward hatch to its final shape and also the companionway hatch. And I've got this beam across here just to clamp that edge down. The trickiest part about this is that where you have an edge like there and here, and you're bending this deck down, those edges are going to want to lift up, and there's a lot of force on them. And so when I glue this, I'll probably have like 4 clamps across here to hold this down. You can put screws too, but it's really hard not to end up with the edge, you know, just lifting up just ever so slightly. And it's not really a big deal, but you do want to keep an eye out for like an excessive gap there. This edge is probably not so much of a problem because it's connected across here. But this gives you an idea of my dry fit. And so I'm just looking to see that, you know, there's kind of like even pressure everywhere, like when I pull down on it. And one spot that I noticed is right here where the outer deck beam intersects. That's the bulkhead number 2. I don't know if it shows up in the camera, but it's a little bit of a high spot across there, and it'll still bend down to that spot. And the deck is going to have, you know, a hatch here and lines over it and non-skid, so it's not really highly critical that this be perfectly you know, fair lines streaming through here. But I am sighting this upper shear line to make sure it's very fair. And the way the shear strake is CNC cut, the bevel for the shear strake goes to the inboard edge of the shear strake itself. So if you look here, that kind of shows what I'm talking about. I've beveled it all the way to the inboard edge of the side of the shear strake. So these bulkheads angles are designed to come down and intersect with that inboard edge. So this top edge gets planed away ever so slightly. But again, when you're planing that, use a long plane. I'm using like a number, I think it's a number 6 plane, and just, you know, keep eyeing that edge for fair. You'll be able to hide it again with the tow rail, but it's good just to, you know, try to keep it fair. And another thing that I forgot to mention regarding the butt blocks is if you do use butt blocks, it allows you to put one side down at the time if you really wanted to. Basically, you know, we're trying to eliminate pieces if we can, and the butt blocks are, you know, sort of the way it would have always been done, but you know, trying to simplify a little bit. But if you're working by yourself, it might be easier to do the butt blocks. And in the plans, it also says not to cut these holes out until after you've glued the deck on. But in hindsight, it's probably easier to glue. It's probably easier to cut the holes out first because, you know, you can see it allows you to do a lot more clamping, and it'll be easier to manipulate the panel. You know. So I don't know. There's with all of these little jobs, there's like 5 different ways to do it. We've shown one way. Everybody will do it slightly differently. There's not really a right or a wrong. one of the reasons we didn't go ahead and cut out these hatches in the CNC kit is because you accrue error, or we expect builders to accrue some error as they're building. So, you know, if your seat top panel fits perfectly, that's amazing. But if you're 1/8 of an inch off here or there, you know, it can be a problem. So with the cabin top, if we had gone ahead and cut these holes out, and then let's just say bulkhead number 2 ended up a little bit out of place, or a little bit out of, you know, square to the boat, then, well, you end up with gaps here and there. So it just makes a lot more sense to cut the deck top based on the as-built boat. And so that's why they're not pre-cut. So I'm going to get the other cabin top panel, which is here, trimmed and sanded and dry fitted. I'll dry fit my butt blocks. I'll probably scribe the overhang and go ahead and cut off some of my overhang just to make it less work later on. And then we're going to try to glue this deck down this evening. Okay, welcome back. It's the next day. I got just the first half glued down last night, and it was a little more work than I anticipated it being. Mainly cleaning up the squeeze out was the hardest task. So I think if you're working by yourself, it's definitely the way to go, to do it one half at the time, because it took me a lot longer to clean up all the epoxy squeeze out under here than I anticipated. So today I'm gonna glue the other side down, and I'll do the butt blocks. And I tried to put little fillets everywhere. It was just taking too long, and it's not really necessary, so I just cleaned it up with a putty knife, and I did pretty well. You can see here, one last thing I did is I put a hole on the outboard side of the hanging knee, which is going to be a wire chase. And that hole runs forward. There's the forward hanging knee, and right up into that little corner on bulkhead number 2. That'll let me run a wire behind this outboard deck beam forward, and then I can run across my bulkhead number 2 if I want to do cabin top like strip lighting or something like that. And also it'll let me run the wires up to the nav lights. On the top of the cabin, I just used drywall screws and plywood pads. Now these, you won't have much of a hard time getting these out, because these were drilled after I put the epoxy in, so the screws didn't get a lot of epoxy on the thread, so I don't expect to have trouble getting those screws out. I'll still use like a hand screwdriver instead of my screw gun, just to make sure I don't break one off. But typically you only have struggles getting the screws out if you've used them, if you pre-drilled the holes before you put epoxy on the joint, because that gets epoxy down into the hole and all over the screw threads. So I'm going to leave those in today because I don't need to work on that edge, and give that epoxy a chance to get a little harder, just so I don't have to worry about, you know, that edge possibly pulling up a little bit. But I can take all these clamps off. I'll take that screw out. I'll take this screw out. And you can see, I'll show you if I look from this angle, there's a little bit of crown this way, but the butt block will pull that flat. And this will be under the garage, remember. This will all be covered, so that doesn't matter. And there's a little bit of a crown on the forward panel as well, but I'll put a straight edge across it when I do my butt block, so that'll take that out. Here's my setup for gluing the butt blocks. I've got a straight edge clamped across that gap that I was showing you earlier, and here's my butt block. And so from underneath, I'm gonna glue my butt block in just like that. Sorry about the light. And attach it with probably 3 screws up from underneath, and those screws will go right into this beam temporarily, and that will give me a flange on this side here for the other panel. So when I put the other panel down, I'll put 3 screws up from underneath as well to clamp the butt block to the inboard edge of the port side of the cabin top panel. And on this side I've got the same setup. This fits in here, so I'm going to glue that now. These pieces of wood, I've got a piece of packing tape on them, so that will keep it from sticking, and I left about a 1/16 of an inch here so I can clean up the squeeze out between the 2 panels with a putty knife. Okay, we just got the port side glued down. You can see my squeeze out. Now I used a plastic bag, like a icing bag, to dispense this epoxy. And with my epoxy pumper right there, it took about 17 pumps thickened to like a mayonnaise consistency. You don't want it too thick for this kind of job because there's a lot of surface area, and if you have it too thick, it's hard for it to squeeze out. So I've used some clamps here around the forward hatch, and you can see my butt block there with additional screws now on the port side of the center line. And that's on both of these. That one's about to drip on me. And basically, I just added those screws to pull the center of the port side down, and I could see visually where it became level with the starboard side. And also you're looking for squeeze out. So I got good squeeze out up there. Now these screw holes, we don't care about those. We're going to fill those in later. And on the outside I've got a block approximately every 5 to 6 inches. And when you screw those blocks in, I'm using a pilot hole, and I'm angling the pilot hole so that it is parallel to the shear strake. So you're actually leaning the drill inboard, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but remember, you don't want any screws to poke out through the inwale on the inside, so you better angle it parallel with the shear strake. So I'm going to get to work cleaning all this squeeze out up. Probably going to take me an hour or two, and we'll bring you back when we do the next thing. I just finished cleaning up all the squeeze out, and here is what we collected. So it's a pretty wasteful process doing the laminating as far as the epoxy goes, but it's kind of has to be done because you need enough epoxy on there to squeeze out. This is the tool that I used. It's about an inch and a quarter wide putty knife, and a couple areas here. The butt blocks are notorious for continuing to squeeze out epoxy because they have a big surface area. So like that corner right there, I've cleaned it out like, I don't know, 6 times, and it keeps a little blob keeps forming. So I'll be sure to check back on that in a little while. And a headlamp is definitely necessary because it's dark in here now, obviously. And also eye protection, because especially if your epoxy was a little runnier than mine. I had a few blobs land on my shirt and my shorts doing this. But otherwise it went pretty well. It took me exactly an hour to clean up all the squeeze out from all these beams, which is going to make it look really nice when we get it painted in here. So that's the cabin top glued down. So once I can get clamps off of there, we'll put on our hatch structure, and in the meantime I'm probably going to start trying to finish my outboard well. Here's the motor well, and this is the final iteration. I've already hot glued it in place. I put a couple little tacks of hot glue here, and here, and I'm using the kit parts, which I cut the end off and matched up with this piece, and I've got a 2x6 here for the motor clamp, I've got some cross beams here which are keeping these aft longitudinal bulkheads in plane with the existing cleats, and I laid a straight edge across the top edges fore and aft of those longitudinal bulkheads to make sure they line up with the ones in the ballast tank. This is the ballast tank, so the water stops here. This is all filled with water in addition to the space on the other side of that bulkhead, which is in the cabin under the bridge deck. And this area back here is all dry in the boat. We put a inspection hatch right here behind the mizzen mast. The mizzen mast sits right on this bulkhead, and that's just to inspect it and let it air out when the boat's in storage. So here you can see the well, and I've left about 3/4 of an inch of bottom sticking inboard past the sides of the well. But after this is glassed, I'm actually going to cut a notch out the back so that there'll be a hole in the transom. I'll actually have a notch out of the bottom of the transom, so I'll have to raise my lower gudgeon by a few inches. And the purpose for that is to let the water escape out the back of the boat and not be sort of rammed up against the bottom of the vertical transom stiffener. And that's the way the Princess plans show, and the way that the princesses that I've seen in the pictures have done it, and that's the way I'm gonna do it. And I decided not to worry about whether or not my well will fit the 4-horse Tohatsu with the reverse gear. I think it will fit, and if it doesn't fit, we'll just modify it. So we're gonna go ahead and fillet these pieces in and let them glassed and finish out the cleats, and that'll allow us to put the sole down. Okay, moving on with the deck. I took out all the screws and I did a quick sanding of the ridge between the two panels. It came out pretty good, and I immediately dry fit my rails because it's kind of an exciting step. Last night I glued together my foredeck hatch, and I took some pictures of that. And this is how I decided to glue my rails down. It's important to get the rails exactly parallel and straight, and also you don't want any dips this way. I actually had a little bit of a valley in my cabin top, maybe a fat 32nd. And so what I did here is I cut some sticks, four cross pieces that were a pretty snug fit with the channel, and I put a little blue tape around the end, and then I clamped those sticks into the channel, and it was kind of a press fit, but not really tight, just the tape made it sort of a press fit. And the thing that does for you is the table saw cut ends of those sticks. When you clamp it together, it squares up the rails really nicely, and it maintains the gap all the way full length. So I cut these the exact width of the sliding hatch, which in this case is 25 1/8. And then all I had to do was line up the back edge of the rails with the cabin top, which I trimmed a little bit so I could. This little block is just acting like a backstop. And then I just matched the gap on both sides between here and here. And at the front, I put some witness marks on the deck, evenly spaced away from the center line gap of the cabin top, which came out really well on center. So then you can see on this side I've got a metal straight edge, and that's clamping down the length of the port rail, which is just keeping it perfectly straight, and it's helping to straighten this one. This one didn't need a rail, it was already pretty straight. The port side had a little bit of a curve to it, and you can see I've made a pretty nice fillet on the outside. It's a normal fillet I would use for glassing. You know, it's about a 1/2 inch or 5/8 radius. And I didn't try to do the fillet on the inside, I just cleaned it up because there's too many clamps in the way. So of course I tried the sliding hatch, and that's another way to do it, but I couldn't think of a way to glue the rails down and be able to clean up all the squeezed out glue using the sliding hatch as the jig. So this is what I came up with, and it did have a tendency to want to rack a little bit, but as long as you line it up on these ends and you make sure it's straight and even from the center line at the forward end, I think it's a good way to do it. So I don't have any screws holding it down to the deck. This is pushing on it just a little bit because it was trying to drag that way a hair. This clamp here is putting just a tiny bit of downward pressure here and here, but I didn't want to put any downward pressure in the middle because, like I said, there was a little bit of a dip, like a 1/32 dip. So I just let it settle on the thickened epoxy, and that worked out pretty nicely. So I'm pretty happy with it now. So I'm not going to touch it for a while, let that kick off. And in the meantime, I glued that wooden piece I made down at the bottom of the cooler. I decided we needed a hard surface at the bottom of the cooler, so after that sets up, I'll fill it all the corners and we'll put a piece of glass in there. And I've got my cooler lid over here. I had just enough foam to make the top of the cooler box if I glued up 100 pieces together. So that's what I did. Is probably 5 minutes faster than going and buying a piece of foam, but I was trying to avoid that. And back here yesterday I glassed these joints here on the outboard edge of the well and the aft longitudinal bulkheads. Haven't done anything in the inside yet, but I held all these pieces down with hot glue, little tacks of hot glue about every 18 inches or so, and I use those cross spacers. And so now I've got a coat of epoxy, pretty heavy coat, in the bottom of the outer bays, and then I'll get in here afterwards and do the glassing on the inside, but I'm also going to put a little bulkhead right here to seal off the well. And I'm still pretty sure I'm going to run a drain pipe from the ballast tank from here back to the well, so that when I'm on the trailer I can pull a plug here and drain the well. So that's about it. I can't really get in the cabin now that I've glued that up, so if I do anything else, it'll probably be like coating my sliding hatch, which is right there on the table, or I can clean up my forward hatch, which was glued up yesterday, sand all those edges, get it smoothed out, and radius the top of it.